All right. Good evening, friends, colleagues. HB 1264. This is a bill to place the issue of cannabis legalization on this November's ballot. After the many hours of angry testimony we just heard, I think there are plenty of folks who might benefit from this bill. So, kidding aside, this is my third year in a row bringing this bill before you, and the bill has actually evolved and changed every time I've brought it in. I'll explain those changes in a second. But, you know, this is basically, at this point, a political issue. And I think we all know where things are headed. States around us are beginning to adopt legalization. In our own state, we now have open markets for medical marijuana. And the polling numbers, which I will hand out after this hearing is over, show that nationally and in Maryland, a supermajority of voters are now supporting legalization, and that includes members of both parties and members from counties around the state. Anne Arundel and Howard, actually, surprisingly, are currently leading the state in terms of support for legalization, with well over 60 or 70% of the populations there in favor of that bill. Little other quick data point, you know, I started this effort 3 years ago where I was the only co-sponsor of my own bill. Last year, I had 16 people on the bill, and this year we've got 27 of my colleagues who are co-sponsors of this bill. But interestingly enough, the geographic distribution of our sponsors has grown, and we now have folks from Montgomery, Harford County, Howard County, Baltimore City, Frederick, and Prince George's, all with the same message that it's time for the politicians to get out of the way and let the voters decide the fate of cannabis legalization. So, you know, I know that the revenues that are piling up in other states are getting people more interested in this. And in fact, one sign that I think that we're getting closer and closer to pulling the trigger on this is that I swear to you that in the last few weeks, I've had countless people, advocates, lobbyists, colleagues come to me with suggestions about how to spend the cannabis legalization money as if it were for sure going to come online. And indeed, this might be one of the few new revenue sources that we have available in Maryland as we face a nearly $900 million annual budget deficit in the coming years. So, you know, I talk about the money, but, you know, you all know me. The money actually has very little to do with why I'm interested in this policy change. If you look at the fiscal note to this bill, you will see that in Maryland there continue to be thousands of people facing criminal sanctions for possession of marijuana, and this is true years after we have supposedly decriminalized possession of a plant. And so, you know, the basic problem with this is that, you know, we just passed a bill to overhaul our medical marijuana system, and there was a lot of fighting over it because basically we're about to make a lot of people rich by allowing them to grow, sell, and otherwise produce marijuana and marijuana products, and yet the very same activity by other people continues to be seen as a criminal enterprise. And I don't think that's right, and I don't think we had intended for thousands of people in Maryland to continue having criminal records over this issue. So, you know, I think where we're headed is we need to get away from the black market that we are allowing to continue to exist when we all know that the public at large continues to use this substance, and I've seen little signs that they're using it less, and so all of that adds up to we have untested, unregulated products being sold, but the profits going to an illicit underground market instead of into the tax coffers, where I think they should be steered towards more productive public health outcomes. So with that, let me just highlight a few aspects to this bill. The important thing is this: the voters, if we approve this, are basically being asked to decide the fate of legalization up to 1 ounce, some accommodation for folks that want to grow this. The referendum language specifically says that employers can continue to prohibit usage and that property owners could continue to regulate and prohibit smoking on their property. And most other details, including the tax structure and things of that nature, would be decided in the 1 year that follows cannabis legalization. So there's a lot in here. I'm happy to answer questions about it. We've got a few days left before crossover, so I'm open to amendments. If we want to move this thing out, that's plenty of time to get it done. So with that, I will actually let me invite some of my panelists up with me, and they might also have some additional thoughts on how we structured it this year.
Good evening. For the record, my name is Kate Bell. I'm with the Marijuana Policy Project. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. It's the largest organization in the country dedicated to ending prohibition. We have run 5 of the 8 campaigns in the states that have taxed and regulated marijuana for adult use around the country. So marijuana prohibition has failed, just like alcohol prohibition before it. A lot of people don't know that alcohol prohibition at the federal level was never the prohibition of possession. It was the prohibition of sale. And a lot of people also don't know that Maryland resisted this and refused to ever pass a state enforcement of that federal alcohol prohibition. And Maryland should use that same good common sense now. This is not about being pro-marijuana. People who are already consuming marijuana, despite the fact that it's illegal, in fact, 9% of the population in this country is doing so. But the greatest harm from marijuana isn't anything inherent in the substance itself. It's in prohibition. Decrim was a good step forward because it did help keep some people out of the criminal justice system for using something safer than alcohol, but it doesn't go far enough because marijuana has to come from somewhere. It doesn't just appear on people's coffee tables. And so the question is, do you want it to come from gangs and cartels, or do you want it to come from lawful, taxed, regulated businesses? And you don't have to take my word for the success of this. There's a couple quotes from the Attorney General and the Governor of Washington State, and I'll just read one briefly. State and federal prohibition of marijuana failed to prevent its widespread use, which was generating huge profits for violent criminal organizations. The people of Washington State chose by popular vote to try a different path. Under Washington's system, responsible adults are allowed access to a highly regulated product that returns substantial tax revenues to the government, even as it displaces illegal activity. And so we would ask for a favorable report of this bill to allow the people of Maryland to follow the people of Washington in making that common sense choice. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Neil Franklin. I am the Executive Director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. I think I know most of you in here. I've testified before you many times before, as I represent literally thousands of law enforcement folks from around the country with our organization. I think you also know that I have a 34-year policing history in the state of Maryland, retired from the Maryland State Police, but let me get right to the point. Number one, I've submitted written testimony, so I really hope that you read that. It has a lot of great details in it regarding the law enforcement position on this piece of policy and the reason for moving it forward and supporting it. Well, let me speak to something really important here. Many of my law enforcement comrades, leaders in the police field, former commissioners of the Baltimore Police Department, Bratton from the NYPD have said time and time again that the violence a lot of the violence we're seeing in our streets is because of the illicit marijuana trade. Why? It's because it's the #1 moneymaker in the illicit drug market. and the competition is fierce among the gangs and the crews in our streets. If we want to move forward and deal with the violence in Baltimore, as we have been discussing in Annapolis, this crime bill, a good first step is to move forward this piece of legislation and develop a regulated market and move this product out of the hands of criminal gangs and organizations and into a regulated, controlled market. It's not complicated. And you will see a dramatic change in the violence in Baltimore City. I guarantee it. One thing that should be quite notable to you today is that when you look behind me, in years past, we had a sea, literally a sea of law enforcement officials in opposition to this legislation. They're not here because they get it. They finally get it. And it's time to move forward. So I, along with thousands of law enforcement members in our organization and many law enforcement members from the state of Maryland, ask for you to give this bill a favorable report. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Delegate Kittleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've heard people say things, I'm not sure it was about marijuana, but the idea of making marijuana legal so that you can buy it and to cut down on the illicit trade. That makes a lot of sense. Are growers and sellers of marijuana going to be able to compete with the black market? Are they going to be able to sell it at a lower price so that we will encourage people to buy it that way?
I can just tell you, I mean, a lot of that is going to be how you set the tax rates, and other places have had to adjust to try and nudge their market into a optimized point where they think they're achieving that goal. So there's been a little bit of trial error in some places that have opened markets, but I think it's an eminently achievable goal.
If I could very briefly touch on that. We've seen a 70% reduction in Colorado in the illicit market in a couple of years since stores have opened. It's not going to, instantly disappear overnight, obviously. But another thing that's been proposed, interestingly, in another state of New Jersey is gradually increasing the tax rate over time to allow, because what we do see is in states that have allowed this, wholesale prices will decrease because so much of the price of cannabis is because of the risks associated with prohibition. So once businesses get up and running and are able to recoup some of that investment, prices will come down and it will be much more competitive, and in some cases equal to what the black market price is.
Yeah, I think another thing that you see is that when you have a legal market in place, number one, you have choices. Number two, you have a safe place to buy what you want to consume instead of on some street corner or trying to meet someone new and make your purchase. Number three, even if it is a little bit more, most people are going to buy from a legal market versus an illicit market, and mainly because it will still be against the law to participate in any illicit market. So why take the chance when I can just walk down here to a legal establishment, buy what I want, have choice. If I'm not happy with my product, you know what? I can go back. I can take it back.
Question, with the answer you gave, I like, but the follow-up that people might argue is, since you've made it so easy, aren't you going to increase the number of people who are going to use marijuana?
Well, the great news is that youth use has not gone up. And that's actually coming from the federal data. So the federal government does the Healthy Kids, I think it's called, survey every year. And there has not been an increase in teen use in any of the states that have legalized cannabis. So that's really the number one concern, obviously, is young people. I think you may see a slight increase in adult use of cannabis. But the vast majority of people who want to use cannabis are already using it, regardless of the law. So I don't think it's going to be, and also it's a safer alternative to alcohol for adults. So it can actually benefit society because it's not associated with violence like alcohol is. So there could actually be benefits to that.
I would actually also flag, I mean, just one of the interesting things that jumps out at me is the decrease in opioid prescriptions in states that have brought medical marijuana programs online. And so I think, this is all speculative, but the idea of displacing other substances. And for me, I've been far more concerned about alcohol, for many years. I think a lot of the violence, the drunk driving and things you see like that, it's even in the driving studies I've seen where they've looked at cannabis, alcohol, it's almost always the combination of alcohol in tandem with it that leads to trouble.
And I think we know by now we can't eradicate marijuana use and the illicit market. As a matter of fact, we can't even shrink it at any level. I, from a law enforcement perspective, believe the best resolution is to bring it under the law into a regulated place. And take it and remove it from the hands of the cartels, criminal gangs, organized crime. It just makes good sense.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you all so late. So the way this would play out if it passed, would it set up a structure across the state similar to our county liquor boards? I see that we see the ability for each of the counties to kind of add their extra layer of regulation. Is that how it would play out, or would it completely be out of the comptroller's office? I was just wondering.
If you look at what page is this? Sorry, I don't have it. Page 5. Okay. The medical cannabis licensees are grandfathered in immediately just to get a program up and running, and then details are to be filled out. So that's at least the grandfathered structure. Now, like I said, however, we have a few days till crossover, and we can continue discussing this if you have an alternate theory of the case.
Under this, as it currently is, it'd be for the people who are currently approved, so it wouldn't be any of the folks that's in the queue.
It would be the businesses that exist at the time of passage. So presumably there would be potentially, depending on what you guys do this year, additional businesses that would be licensed before this would kick in. Also, there is some measure of local control. Local businesses would be allowed to limit the number of businesses in their jurisdiction. To ban retail stores, local jurisdictions would be able to decide if they wanted to allow social consumption or not. It may make sense in a densely populated area, and less sense in a rural area where there's more concerns about driving, for example. But it would not be, when we say regulate marijuana like alcohol, we don't mean replicating a 2,000-page alcohol code.
Yeah.
And just to get back to this whole issue of the grandfathering, the medical licensees, they've already gone through a process, so there, we can shortcut the vetting there. But I would point out that we very specifically try to avoid some of the issues that have been raised in the medical licensing process and have put up front pushing the regs towards diversity and inclusiveness, and also a bit about small business, since there is some concern about whether the medical program relies too heavily on investor pools that require large upfront capital.
Thank you. I look forward to talking to the sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If this bill passes, is there a plan, an aggressive plan to educate the citizens so they can make an informed decision?
You don't mean about the referendum itself. You mean if the referendum passes.
If the referendum passes, yes. Well, no, I'm asking if this bill passes.
Oh, well.
Are you prepared to educate?
Well, I can't make any commentary about what MPP and the other organizations are willing to do for a ballot measure.
Certainly, the first step would be to set up a campaign committee, which is a separate entity that would then run a campaign in support of the initiative. Yes, that would be our intention. And I'm sure that there would be an opposition campaign that would also form itself in order to oppose, and we would see what the public thought about the opposing arguments.
I would imagine this would look much like we saw with the DREAM Act and marriage equality campaigns, a yes on A and a no on A side springing up, in public education campaigns, media discussion, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Delegate Atterbury.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I have a couple concerns. One, kind of following up on Delegate Proctor's question, but put differently, if the referendum passed, how would you make citizens informed so that they could make an informed decision? Because I think Maryland, particularly in like the DMV area, we're uniquely situated, right? And so people have federal jobs, they have to get security clearances. I mean, a lot of people make their living this way. So then if all of a sudden they think, hey, you know, we can start doing this because it's legal in Maryland, but it's not legal where they work, you know, I'm just really curious about how that would work. And then my other question is, I mean, I would have a serious concern about the issuance of licenses. I mean, with how everything went down with the medical cannabis, that was a serious problem. And I mean, Delegate Moon, you and I spoke. I mean, quite frankly, I'm not for this, but if it were to pass, I mean, I would have to seriously take a look at minority participation. Like, that would be huge for me. Minority participation and education to make sure that people who are living in this area aren't, you know, inadvertently or stupidly, you know, foregoing job prospects because they engage in something that they think is legal everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I actually share your concern. I had a lot of reservations about the way the medical licensing process was playing out. And again, not just in the diversity issue, but the whole issue about whether small businesses and entrepreneurs could spring up and take advantage of the new opportunities, or whether this really was just going to be a bunch of out-of-state investor pools coming in with big money and not really even benefiting, you know, some of the folks impacted by the drug war. And there are actually a number of people that have come by my office to talk about this very issue. So that's why we did put a little bit of a tip of the hat into the bill this year to push the regs in that direction. But to be perfectly honest, you know, it's been my hope that we keep the text, and it's not a thin bill, it's still a few pages, but to keep this pretty general so that the public is basically voting on broad parameters of a yes or no on the legalization, and that you really would have the fight over the regulatory structure in the year that follows. Again, I'm happy to beef up some of those sections in here, you know, if we can talk about it. I think the idea of grandfathering in the medical licenses is that we already had people that had gone through a vetting process, and we'd want to get the program up without unnecessary delay. I mean, just if you look at how long and how many iterations the medical program itself has gone through, we are way behind other states in terms of being open for business. And, you know, and that frankly has put this adult use issue, I think it's delayed this very bill, you know, potentially pushing it off of this year also due to the medical delays. And so, you know, look, I know I say there are a lot of reasons to do this, but I also have to be very blunt on the revenue side of this, that you know, you're seeing states on the East Coast now doing it. It was just the West Coast and, you know, Rocky Mountain states first, and now we've got DC and our own backyard, Massachusetts and others opening. And this, I think there's a revenue implication to when we time out the opening of our system. And we all know it's going to happen. So that, you know, I just put that, you know, as the context there. It's going to happen.
On the education side, across the country in the states that have moved forward, there have been some really good educational programs regarding the topics that you brought up. Many advocate organizations that are out there doing great work. We have many of those organizations here in the state of Maryland. And we also feel that it's very important to educate the citizens regarding the challenges that they may experience and the things that they need to be aware of. So I have no doubt that that process would take place at a very high level to ensure that people are as aware as they need to be regarding their employment issues and the rights that employers have to restrict people from using certain substances and so on, and other areas as well. That's what we've seen.
We've also seen the police force get involved in educating people. In fact, in Seattle, they actually stood outside HempFest with bags of Doritos with educational stickers on what is and is not lawful and allowed under the new law. And certainly we would hope to see that here as well, so people know what the limits are that they're allowed to possess and how much they would be allowed to cultivate and all those things, so that they're not running afoul of the law by accident.
And I've also seen advertisements like that at airports now, you know, where typically, places that have legalized, they try to explain what the parameters are for being able to fly with things you bought in a legal state.
Don't.
Yes, so correct. That's the punchline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of comments and a question. The first comment is that, pick up on what Delegate Moon said, the death rate in states that have medical cannabis programs, the death rates from opioids is 25% less. That's from the Journal of the American Medical Association, not some hippie Times. So JAMA, 25% less. In terms of licenses, actually today I was out of the committee room here in HEO because I was introducing House Bill 268, which did something that I long felt should have happened at the beginning, which is to have no caps on the number of growers. That, frankly, was a political accommodation in order to get the bill passed. You can watch the testimony to see the reasons why. But, frankly, if we had done that, we would have solved a lot of these problems. And also, instead of creating an oligopoly or a monopoly for a few, it would have allowed truly minority businesses and people with smaller amounts of money to get into the medical cannabis industry. We don't regulate the number of lawyers or doctors or bus drivers or whatever, electricians. You need a high bar to get in and then, compete in the marketplace. And that actually was largely the sentiment of most of the people who worked on this bill back in 2010, 11, 12, and 13. And frankly, if you look at Delegate Glenn's bills and my bills from those times, we had no caps. And Delegate Glenn's bills further had a grow your own component. Mine did not. So, House Bill 2 is passed, and I'm urging the HEO committee to take the caps off. The other reason, by the way, to digress, is not just because it would be a marketplace approach. It would allow people who aren't super rich to get into this business, but actually, if you look down the timeline of medical cannabis science and understand the genomics of how drugs are metabolized, which is coming rapidly, there are going to be niche cannabis products for very specialized diseases or rare diseases that will only be grown by a small grower, maybe not even quarter the size of this carpet here in front of me. But that person will never get to go in that business. So people with a couple $100,000 could do that. They still have to meet all the safety and security and all the other requirements, but they would then be able to grow a product for certain kinds of dementia or musculoskeletal diseases. And by the way, there's even cannabinoids now that are being researched for healing bone fractures, just to tell you how far this is going. So one day you may get a splint and a cannabinoid salve or something. Here's my question. Delegate Moon. Yes. There is a question. I've been quiet most of the day, Mr. Chairman. So here's my question. This only happens, the public only votes if we vote, right?
That is correct. Right.
And what can we do to see that we vote on this bill? And if we don't get to vote in this committee, what can we do about it? And I would urge the chairman, Mr. Chairman, to, have a vote on this bill. Vote it up, vote it down, and move on. But what can we do?
I think you just did it.
Well, I'll do it again, Mr.
He's right
Chairman.
there.
I still have the floor, so we can, I think you can petition stuff to the floor and all that other stuff. But, Mr. Chairman, I would urge you here to, no, we don't want a petition. We'll do it. I'm sure that'll happen at some point. But, Mr. Chairman, I would urge you to trust the committee, vote it up or vote it down. If it votes up, trust the people. And if people vote it down or we vote it down, that's it. So that's my statement, and I really urge you to do that in fairness to Delegate Moon and the people who've been testifying for this bill for the last few years, and to let the process that we supposedly believe in actually go forward. Thank you.
Mr. Chair. I'm concerned, have some concerns here. I did vote for medical marijuana. I think there's 2 Republicans who did. And I actually voted for decrim. I may have been the only Republican, but I don't want to put people in jail for pot, unless maybe they're a dealer. But I do have some concerns. I think that a lot of people who smoke marijuana, or a good percentage, think that it's okay to get behind the wheel and drive. And my question to you, Delegate Moon, or the police officer, do you think it's okay to drive a car when you're on pot? And also, what is your plan to stop people from getting behind the wheel? What's your plan to educate Marylanders if this bill passes, like the Delegate Proctor said? So if you could answer that, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, and my colleagues should be somewhat familiar with my views on this issue. We obviously don't want people engaging in impaired driving One of the challenges is that we can't create a direct alcohol-like parallel in how we do this, right? Per se, BAC type standard, because that's just not how it works. You can have people who smoke and then, days later would test, at some level of arbitrary impairment based on, the number we choose. And that this issue came up in other states that have looked at this, where the medical programs that had preceded the adult use programs generated quite a bit of concern, because when part of the political compromise to get the adult use going, some of the states said, okay, we'll put in an arbitrary number as the THC limit that you're allowed to have. And the medical folks said, well, wait a second. Now all these cancer patients basically aren't allowed to drive because you put this arbitrary standard in. And so I think where we want to go in Maryland is to go to an actual impairment standard, not some made-up number with made-up technology that vendors are trying to push on us. And that would mean, at least for now, a reliance probably on drug recognition experts, which we currently have, and hopefully we put some of the revenues back into studying the issue further, coming up with further recommendations and public education.
So, Delegate Glass, 34 years in policing, it's always been illegal to drive impaired under the influence of any drug, alcohol, prescription drugs, and marijuana. And yes, we know there are people currently out there driving under the influence of marijuana. They're doing it while it's illegal now. Better trained police officers for identifying people that are driving under the influence of any substance. We need to continue doing that, working down that path, and that's what some states are doing. Many states are doing that. Creating more drug recognition experts so that they can make this determination when someone is impaired and take the appropriate action. Let me just say this, that the people who are driving under the influence of marijuana and other drugs now are lawbreakers, and we all know that. If we move to pass this piece of legislation and the voters vote for it and it does go through, any increase in use of marijuana will be by law-abiding citizens. Do you understand that? So if there's an increase in use, they're law-abiding citizens because they waited until this law passed to make it legal to use. They also know that it will be illegal to drive under the influence, as it is now. Why all of a sudden would they become lawbreakers and drive under the influence when they waited for it to become legal? Because they're law-abiding citizens. My point is this, and I hope you were able to follow me on that. Any increase in use will be by law-abiding citizens who will obey the law and not drive under the influence. That's why they waited.
I would just say that not everybody speeds. Most of us follow the law, but most of us speed a little bit. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm following you, but that's fine. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, Delegate Queen.
One quick question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delegate Moon, maybe you can answer this, or maybe some on your panels. You mentioned one of the motivations for this was the impact to people who are incarcerated for these sorts of crimes. What has happened, or what would happen, or what has happened in other states if this referendum would pass? Do people get grandfathered to be released? Is there some sort of a way that we redress that to make sure that they're properly restored? Do we know what's happened in other places with regard to the criminal justice system in terms of people who may have been incarcerated?
I just saw, and I assume Kate would know more, but I just saw California making moves on vacating convictions. Obviously, we passed an expungement law last year that was very much pegged to the fact that we decriminalized, right? So I tend to think these things come after the policy changes. I don't know whether the fact of this being a state constitutional change has an impact on prior convictions, but I will defer to...
It doesn't. So the implementing legislation that would hash out the details, as Delegate Moon mentioned, of licensing and things like that, could certainly include additional expungement provisions above and beyond the bill that you all passed last year, as well as resentencing. Those measures were included in the California initiative, which was much, much, much longer and more detailed because that was one that was drafted and signatures were collected. It's also, expungement is being proposed to be included in other states that are looking at this now. For example, New Jersey includes an expungement provision in their draft bill that they're considering. So it's certainly something that we would definitely support including in implementing legislation in 2019 and taking a look at that. It's not something that happens automatically. I mean, that's why, for example, when the federal government halfway fixed the crack cocaine sentencing disparity, there had to be a decision, is this going to be retroactive? And then you have to actually go back and look at all those cases, which also obviously is going to take some time and resources on the part of the criminal justice system to go back and take a look at those. But given the racially disparate enforcement of the marijuana laws, it's certainly something we would support.
And I would just say, part of my policy motivation here, both with gambling and with marijuana, I've tried to knock the criminal penalties down on this because I find it very peculiar that the state is allowing people to make millions of dollars through legal frameworks now on both gambling and marijuana while we incarcerate people for doing the exact same thing. I find that very problematic as a matter of policy.
Mr. Chair, I know it's very late, but Mr. Delegate Moon, do you think in the sphere of educating everybody that you might want to start with the committee here and maybe providing us with a tasting or inhaling experience?
I can get a co-sponsor amendment drafted.
Another panel.
Thank you.
All right, and I'm going to pass around some latest polling numbers.
File on behalf of this bill, come forward, please. Okay. Mr. Sterling's here. Waited long enough. Okay. Who would like to start?
Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Luke Jones. I'm here today representing an organization called Maryland NORML, which is the state chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I currently serve as Director of Legislative Affairs. I'm also a citizen of downtown Silver Spring in Montgomery County. And I wanted to address an issue regarding traffic safety, because I know that it's an area of great concern on this public policy matter. So first, we want to stress that concerns regarding driving under the influence and impairment with regards to marijuana is a legitimate concern. And we think that it's not unfounded, but it does deserve to be placed in its proper context. As it's already been stated, it is already illegal under Maryland law to drive under the influence, and this piece of legislation would not change that fact. But secondly, it's important to point out that we have numerous scientific studies that assess marijuana's impact on accident risk. In fact, the largest ever controlled trial assessing marijuana use in motor vehicle accidents, which was published in 2015 by the U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, reports that marijuana-positive drivers possess virtually no statistically significant crash risk compared to drug-free drivers after controlling for age and gender. And what that means is that people found to have been under the influence concentrate at the younger age ranges. And accidents are also concentrated in those age ranges. So statistically, federally, there's not a statistically significant increase in risk. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Wolf. I am a political associate for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I'm also a recent graduate of the University of Maryland. The 4 years I lived in Maryland were some of my favorite, and now being a DC resident, I don't have to worry about the consequences of consuming or possessing cannabis in the comfort of my own home. So now's the time for Maryland to adopt these common sense policies so that it no longer subjects its residents, arrest and criminality. I also wanted to bring up, I know it was mentioned briefly earlier, the idea of youth access. Actually, in Washington, their Healthy Youth Survey found that marijuana use actually fell among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in the years since it became legal. Also, 8th graders are now reporting that marijuana is actually hard to get. And regulating cannabis would ensure that it stays out of the hands of our youth with these licensed facilities that check IDs. The bill would also end the arrest and conviction of those who grow small amounts of marijuana for personal, non-commercial purposes. And as with our right to homebrew beer, the people that would actually take advantage of this is very limited. Growing cannabis is time-consuming. It's a complicated process. So purchasing cannabis legally in retail stores will always be the more convenient option for the consumer. But the real need for the right for individuals to cultivate these small amounts of cannabis is to remove this compelling state interest for law enforcement to enter a home under the suspicion of a simple odor. So with all that being said, I really urge you all to put this issue before the voters, let them decide. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, delegates, my name is Eric Sterling. I live in Chevy Chase. I run the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation in Silver Spring. I'm testifying on behalf of Maryland Normal today. I ask you to take a look at my prepared statement. We're representing over 3,000 active members in Maryland. More importantly, we're representing about 600,000 adults over the age of 21 who consume marijuana in Maryland. 600,000 people in Maryland, adults, consume marijuana. And right now, of course, most of them do it illegally. And it interferes with their liberty. Liberty appears 10 times in the Declaration of Rights in Maryland. And it seems to me that the kinds of liberties that we expect of ourselves, liberty to use marijuana in our home, to behave as responsible adults, to enjoy the benefits of marijuana, is part of the liberty that we expect. And we have endured, those of us who've used marijuana, what we feel is a tyrannical law. And the question could be, what is the burden of proof? Is the burden of proof upon us to demonstrate to you that marijuana is safe? Or is the burden of proof upon you to demonstrate to us that marijuana is so dangerous that we should be denied the liberty to engage in it? Where does the burden of proof lie? In the states where it's been legalized, we haven't seen a revolution in disorder. The governors in those states support the plan. The citizens in those states support the plan. And the voters in the state, according to polls, support this plan. You've been very patient. You've been here over 9 hours, and you've heard, I am heartened that you are here to hear us. I am heartened that you've sat for 9 hours to do the people's business on a whole manner of emotional and complex issues. I'd like to just address Delegate Proctor's question about the education of citizens. Is it the burden of those of us, of citizens, to take the responsibility of educating the public about marijuana use? Or is it the burden of the schools or the police? Who would educate the public about the law? Those who wish to change it or those who wish to enforce it? When a delegate asks about people driving under the influence and suggests, well, we know certainly that alcohol consumers all know it's against the law, but almost everybody maybe has one drink and drives and risks driving impaired. There are all kinds of behaviors that we endure as part of enjoying liberty. And the risks that marijuana legalization will create for this state are so within the range of the dangers that we endure for living in liberty, to play football, to hunt, to ski. People die in all of those activities. Children are injured and crippled in all of those worthwhile activities because they enjoy liberty. And we ask for that liberty too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair and Committee, for allowing us to come before you today. My name is William Small, and I am a lifelong marijuana user of small degree. I mean, I started using it probably around age 16 when my peers who could get the drug, some of them were about the same age, put it in my hand. In fact, I was in the criminal justice system before I ever used marijuana, and as I lived in a group home from age 15 to 16, and there I met a very smart man named Tawan, and he told me, hey, marijuana's safe. You know, when you get out, you should definitely try it. And so it was already in the criminal justice system that I was referred. But I also am a child of a lifelong marijuana smoker, and he served in Vietnam, came back with PTSD, and has been a criminal under your system ever since. And I mean, I would be horrified to see my testimony before you all, you know, put my forebear in to the criminal justice system. He's evaded for all this time. But my brother is currently in your prison system for marijuana. It's a tragedy. He's got a child on the way, and the child will be born with his father in prison. His beautiful wife will not have my brother at her side when he very much should be. I think anyone would want their husband to be at the side of their daughter-in-law, and to think that over the harmless use of marijuana, where, as others have said before me, the biggest harm that comes from marijuana is that the state harms users. The state harms all of its citizens, whether they're marijuana users or the general public, over marijuana prohibition. And it harms all of the public because marijuana prohibition costs millions in tax dollars every year. And that comes out of all of our pockets to keep people like my brother locked away from their families, because my brother would go so far as to help someone else to get the illicit, the prohibited drug that they want, that their forebear wants. So if you're a PTSD sufferer and you want something and you ask your son, how dare I say, that your son is in a pickle, to say no. So this law needs to be changed, and you all are in the position to change it. Your public is asking you, please, your subjects, help us to get our family members out of the prison system where they should not be, and have mercy on all of your people to change this entirely misguided law and stop the bleeding that has plagued family after family. I'm almost done. Now, I'd like to ask members of the Black Caucus who heroically helped to decriminalize marijuana when members of this body perhaps would not, that if this body refuses to take up this issue and pass it on to the subject for our approval, where I'm sure it will get passed, then please step up again, the Black Caucus, and figure out some way to finagle what you did before and bring this to the floor of the House of Delegates, where I believe it will pass. Thank you.
Questions of the panel? No. Questions of the panel? I just have one. Would you say that this is a gateway drug or not?
No, sir.
Okay,
My first drug was nicotine at age 11.
okay. Your brother's in jail for some other drug.
Marijuana.
I thought you said something about he was helping somebody with some other drug.
No. No, sir. Marijuana.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, for Mr. Sterling specifically, and only Mr. Sterling, the chairman asked if it's a gateway drug. Isn't it also the case that many people could consider cannabis an exit drug? Exit from opioids, exit from other dangerous activities, drug-wise?
Delegate Morheim, you're correct. There are a number of studies that are showing that people who are using, who've been addicted to opioids are using cannabis as a way to transition away from their opioid habits. It's also the case that in a certain sense, marijuana is the terminal drug. It is the last illegal drug that the overwhelming majority of illegal drug users ever consume. The Institute of Health, in their 1999 study on marijuana and science, wrote that there is no scientific basis for making a claim that marijuana is a gateway or stepping stone drug, other than the fact that it is legal.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Does anybody else wish to testify on the bill come forward? Yes, sir, go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding House Bill 1264. Cannabis does not want to be a political issue, and neither should you. House Bill 1264 will put the power to decide on cannabis legislation exactly into the hands of the person that should decide it, your constituents, your voters. This is an election year, so if you're worried about passing cannabis laws through legislation as to what your voters may think of you, well, then take the higher road and let the voters decide. In answer to a quick question, is cannabis an entry drug? I look at cannabis as an exit drug, and I personally use cannabis to get myself off of nicotine, which is one of the hardest substances to break. But that's been some years ago and is over with. But I'm here today as a proud father of 3, a husband to a public school teacher. I am the owner of a second-generation family business. We've been in business for 43 years in Southern Maryland. I'm in the Cub Scout troop, and I'm president of my HOA. In other words, I represent a normal guy with enough common sense to recognize that our current laws do not reflect the society in which we live. As a state in Maryland, we've already taken a huge step. We have a medical cannabis program, finally. Took a long time to get it. A lot of lessons learned. But the one thing it proved is that we don't agree with the federal laws. So we've already crossed this bridge, so we might as well keep on going. The federal government is taking their time on deciding a lot of different issues. So here we are. We have a legal medical system. I'm in Calvert County, where our county commissioners are wasting time for a couple of people debating whether or not a county employee could possibly go to jail for issuing a building permit to a cannabis company. I mean, how is that even a feasible argument? But real quick, I'll finish up. Point of my story is, in conclusion, if you walk across the street, you'll look at some very nice display cases. One of them is highlighting rye whiskey and the birth of an industry. Another is highlighting the end of prohibition. And right next to it is an empty display case. And I think a cannabis display would be perfect in there. Thank you very much.
Before we start the clock, Adrian Matthews, representing the people of Baltimore and Maryland. Thank you for allowing me to speak in this great free state. Freedom, free state. It doesn't matter if you're anti-pot or pro-pot. We all are pro-freedom. And if we were free people, we wouldn't be here asking for the permission to do what we're asking for. So that proves that we aren't free and that this isn't a free country. It's a negative versus a positive rights issue. For us to have this, you all have to do absolutely nothing but let us decide. Unlike the right to an attorney should I couldn't afford one, where everyone here would have to collectively provide me with one. The right to possess cannabis, possess a flower, because that's what it is. It's a flower that grows on a tree, just like apples and oranges. God put it here, and he planted it, it grew, and it's here. You guys don't have to do anything. Just let us decide whether or not we would like to do it or not. You know, if we decide to do it, great. That's what we've been here for. If not, then so be it. I'd like to take the last minute to address some of the questions that were here from last year. I remember Delegate Ray had a question of whether the people in her town would lose their jobs because they're mostly Navy. Well, no, they wouldn't. Just because it becomes legal, the cops aren't going to go start smoking and losing their job. They know better. Everyone knows better. Just like they know they couldn't show up to work and drink, or show up to work drunk, or get in a car and drive drunk, they wouldn't participate in those activities. For the delegate who mentioned the minority business aspect, well, allowing this will let people like me get our foot in the door because we could grow at home. We can learn these skills at home. A self-starter like me who's taught myself everything, no college, would go home and learn it. I would plant a seed. I would see it grow. I would fail. I would try it again. I would fail. I would try it again. But I could do that in the privacy of my own home, where I taught myself these skills. I wouldn't have to pay money for them. I wouldn't have to go out and pay someone else to teach me that. I could learn it. I could go and then write my own resume, apply to a company that says, hey, I taught myself this. You know, I feel like us preventing the voters from voting on it is just another way to control what people do and don't do in the privacy of their own home. And I feel like if we're all here for liberty and freedom, well, it only makes sense to let the voters decide on what or not they do with their own personal lives.
My name's Duke Dunn. I'm representing the SOS PAC. Originally, it was Saving Our Society with police and citizens together, because I networked through the Fraternal Order of Police for community policing and helping the homeless. But then, about 6 years ago or so, LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, at that time, now Law Enforcement Action Partnership, was speaking at NORML, National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws. I photographed for a number of these groups, but anyway, what caught my eye was his shirt, which said, "Cops want to legalize pot, ask me why." And I said, I need to ask him, because I would not bring it up to the Fraternal Order of Police. And I've been smoking 45 years, and it works on my endorphins. It makes me happy and well, but it also, more importantly, it's a medicine, as my cape shows. It works on my endocannabinoid system, which heals a lot of my body and keep it informed. But anyway, when I went to the meeting, he says, I asked him why, and he said, well, for the benefit of our kids and the benefit of us. Why get in trouble for something that is far less troublesome than alcohol that we legal and promote everywhere? And also, as being a Vietnam-era veteran, and being a veteran, you know, we put our lives and limbs on the line for our country. And you know, we fight for liberty and freedom. And that's what we're talking about here, for a plant, for something that is Mother Nature's natural growing healing cannabis plant, approved by the government by patent number 6630507 by the HHS, the United States Human and Health Services. They patent it, and they spelled out a number of medical benefits for it. So, you know, this is something, and we the people, we're getting tired. We're getting tired of, actually, we're starting to call you out, because we know about OpenSecrets.org giving us your top 20 donors and how much, and how you're voting on our lives. And we're getting tired of it, and we're starting to replace and vote people in that will represent the people. And so please make this. And also, I'm playing poppy to my grandchild due to the law, as the one gentleman said as well, about somebody getting locked up. I lost a lady friend also because she had a health issue that marijuana worked for her back deal, but because she had to do the piss test from the ASAP programs, then she couldn't do that because she'd get more trouble, maybe get locked up or fined. So she went to the opioids. She's no longer with us today. We're caught losing. I heard the gateway question. There. They told us that in school, all of us, or majority of us. And they backed off of the gateway drug because they know it's not now, so they're not saying it. And actually, there is proven statements out there by many groups that it is a gateway to lead you off the opioids that are killing people and addicting people and not healing people. The cannabis will heal you. It's a proven medicinal plant. The government proved it, and other groups. Fine. Okay, sorry, but
Thank you very
thank
much.
you.
Any questions of this panel? Thank you very much. Next panel. All right. Is anybody else here testify in favor of the bill? Come forward now. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for hearing my testimony this evening. My name is Joshua Gomes. I reside in La Plata, Maryland, inside of Charles County. I've long since been an advocate for the recreational and medicinal use of, or lack of prohibition of this substance. Bodies developed over the course of millennia to have an endocannabinoid system that desires to be filled by this substance that, as many other people have stated this evening, just grows on this earth without any, without any need for synthesis, to synthesize it, to get any particular components out. It comes in a beneficial form from the earth in its natural form. I was in a very bad accident in 2010. I was hit by a truck and then run over by an F-150. It's hard to believe that I'm here standing, sitting in this position, that I didn't sustain any permanent spinal cord or brain damage. And when I got out, when I was released from the hospital with a very large amount of narcotic pain medication, abdominal pain that could not be mitigated by those opioids, narcotics, various concoction of pharmaceuticals that I was given, the one substance that took that abdominal pain away completely was cannabis. So for people who ask if it's a gateway drug, if it's an exit drug, it's what allows me to be here tonight. It's what allows me to walk around. It's what allows me to get up every day. It's what got me up every day through an excruciating rehabilitation process. 3 years of getting up every single day and consuming cannabis to spark my appetite so that I could eat, so that I could have energy, so that I could rehabilitate myself. The anti-inflammatory components to cannabis are what allow my joints to kind of move freely and allow me to stand up and move around on a daily basis. And with having said all that, I again thank you for hearing our testimony this evening. Thank you all very much for your time this evening, and hope that we have at least tried to show this in a positive light. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions of this witness? All right, is there anybody here testifying in opposition to the bill? Come forward.
Oh, you're a panel?
Yes.
Oh, you're a panel here. I'm an individual here.
Well, you're still a panel. Go with the panel first.
He said all four of us could go, sir.
Anybody here testify? No, you can testify. You
That's
can
fine.
up.
Come on up.
Come on. I didn't know whether you were doing it.
We can do it all together.
Okay. All right, let's hear from you. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Regina Cooper-Averell. I'm the Public and Government Affairs Manager here in Maryland, and I'm also a former law enforcement officer as well. AAA Mid-Atlantic feels very strongly that before Maryland or any state considers legalizing recreational marijuana, it's important that we take a pause. We know that drug driving is on the rise. It's certainly more prevalent than the public may realize. According to a 2013-2014 National Roadside Survey conducted by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, drug use among nighttime weekend drivers has increased nationwide by 25%. The drug showing the greatest spike was marijuana at 48%. This is particularly concerning to us since research has shown that marijuana can have significant effects on drivers' behaviors behind the wheel, particularly impairing psychomotor skills, cognitive functions, many other behaviors. Unfortunately, most states are not fully prepared to handle an increasing spike in drug driving. That's largely because no roadside technology exists that allows our law enforcement officers to measure the levels of THC in the brain, which is where impairment occurs. In an exclusive AAA poll conducted last April, 85% of Maryland drivers surveyed considered someone driving after using drugs a serious threat to their safety. If marijuana is legalized for recreational use, 72% of Maryland drivers indicated that they would be somewhat or very concerned about the dangers posed by others driving on the road. It has taken many years to change attitudes about drinking and driving, and we now begin the same process of educating the public about drug driving. As an advocate for the safety of motorists, AAA is troubled by the safety implications of individuals using marijuana and getting behind the wheel. Quality data and research regarding the scope of the problem and its solutions are woefully lacking. More importantly, there is insufficient scientific data to provide motorists with guidance on the use of the drug in a way that does not impact their ability to drive safely. Legalizing marijuana before we are prepared to manage the potential highway safety consequences and provide law enforcement officers with all the training and resources they need to address this issue is dangerous. Until we know more about how the federal government intends to treat states that legalize marijuana, we believe it is premature to do so in Maryland. I'll wrap it up and say that many compare the revenues that could possibly be generated by marijuana sales, what have you, to gambling in Maryland, and that it could certainly perhaps benefit education. We believe that the public health and safety risk that it would create would certainly outweigh that. On behalf of AAA Mid-Atlantic, I urge an unfavorable report, sir. Thank you.
Go ahead. Good evening. My name is William Jones. I'm here with Smart Approaches to Marijuana organization founded by Congressman Patrick Kennedy and Dr. Kevin Sabet, advisor to 3 administrations on drug policy. And I'm here to oppose HB 1264. Before I begin my testimony, I'd like everyone to take a journey in their mind's eye with me. Go to your home. Open the front door of your home, and if you live in an urban setting, walk down the street to the nearest store to your home. Look at the sign in front of the store. Look through the windows of that store. Keep that in mind, and we're going to come back to that in the course of my testimony. Racial disparities in arrest rates for drugs are a well-documented and lived reality. For decades, drug policy has contributed to skyrocketing incarceration rates among minority populations. And for this reason, I have been proud to partner with those who are supporting decriminalization bills in various states. However, that marijuana legalization and commercialization is promoted as a victory for racial justice is ironic at best. Let's look at marijuana's counterparts, the alcohol and tobacco industry. It is an unjustified reality that in many black communities, a child cannot take a walk down the street without passing a liquor store on every corner. And they cannot even see inside of convenience stores because the store windows are so plastered with advertisements for alcohol and tobacco. Liquor stores in non-white neighborhoods far outnumber those in richer white counterparts. People tell us that we should regulate marijuana like alcohol, and that is what scares me. A study out of Johns Hopkins by Dr. Levis, my wife works at Hopkins as well, showed that in Baltimore, there's 8 times as many liquor stores for minority communities as other communities. And that is why I do not want to see marijuana regulated like alcohol. Already, the marijuana industry, comprised almost entirely of white men, is copying the successful playbook of the alcohol industry. And in Denver, the epicenter of legalized weed, lower-income brown and black neighborhoods are already experiencing this. In one minority neighborhood, there is 1 pot business for every 47 residents. I ask you to go back to that store in your mind's eye when you walked out the front door of your house. When I walk out the front door of my house in any direction, north, south, east, or west, the closest store to my home, right on the border of northeast and southeast D.C., is a liquor store. Just the other day, I'm also a full-time firefighter EMT in Washington, D.C. at Engine 30, the second busiest firehouse in the country. I walked across the street to get some eggs just for the firehouse to a liquor store and looked around. Lottery advertisements, liquor advertisements, and tobacco advertisements filled this convenience store such that I couldn't even see the eggs that I was going for. We have an opportunity right now to do something. We've had the opportunity to show that the marijuana industry will be different than the alcohol and tobacco industry, and the data out of Colorado shows that it's not been doing that. Is there a lot of revenue to be made from that? Yes, but it will be made off of the backs of those least able to burden those in minority communities. In conclusion, the increased availability of marijuana in these neighborhoods matters because while some will argue that marijuana isn't harmful, the science says otherwise. Marijuana users are 3 times more likely to become addicted to heroin than non-users, and frequent pot use by kids is correlated with higher possibilities of welfare dependency and permanent IQ loss.
Thank you.
May I have 2 more minutes? There are
No, not 2 more minutes.
plenty of people that exceeded their time before, and I just request 2 more minutes to finish my remarks, which are here.
Wrap it up. You can't have 2 more minutes. No, go ahead, wrap it up.
Yes, sir. Contrary to the argument that marijuana legalization will promote criminal justice, we've seen that legalization has not produced reductions in incarceration. Advocates of legalization often point out how marijuana arrests have plummeted because of legalization and laud this as a victory for social justice. While the finding itself is true, is not a victory for social justice for 2 reasons, and I'll close with this. There are 2 main metrics that we can look at when evaluating the impact of the criminal justice system in minority populations. The first is the raw percentage of the prison population that is comprised of minorities, and the second is compared to the state percentage of the state population versus others for doing the same thing. In order for legalization to be hailed as having had a positive impact, it should cause a reduction in the minority prison population as well as an equalization in racial disparities of marijuana-related arrests.
Thank you very much.
The rest of my remarks are found in this, and they are cited as well by every sources.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm Dennis Stevens, and I've lived in Maryland all my life. I do have a degree in science education, and I've been interested in this. And there are some interesting things in the written testimony that I have in regard to Colorado. Pardon me? Yeah, you have copies of my testimony. I'm just highlighting one of the things that are in there. And pardon me? Well, I tell you, this thing is full of data because what happens is that this thing is a drug, and I did favor the legalization of marijuana, but I believe that if this were made recreational, I think there are problems of regulating this. I think there's a good possibility that this stuff can be contaminated with higher quantities of THC without anybody knowing about it. And they do have records of this in Detroit, in Colorado, that this has happened. On page 3 of my testimony, I indicate this, and also on page 3, this was in an article in the Denver Post. It says marijuana is figuring into more crashes overall. In 2013, drivers tested positive for drug was 10%. In 2016, it went to 20%. There are too many questions that I had to use for a chemical. A chemical does affect your brain, and I think if you looked at the testimony or some of the stuff that I cited from this from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, that it indicated that it is a problem, and it is a problem for developing brains. And the other thing, whether it's a gateway, I think it probably is. And there is one of the things in this National Institute of Drug Abuse said it is also consistent with animal experience showing THC ability to prime the brain for enhanced responses to other drugs. For example, rats previously administered THC show heightened behavior response not only when further exposed to THC, but also when exposed to other drugs. I just think what we're doing, we're getting into a can of worms. They're not worms, they're spiders, they're rattlesnakes, and I think we probably should reduce the penalties for recreational use of marijuana. That may help. I don't know, I think it would help if we could reduce the penalties. But I think to just, decide, we'll put it to the voters to decide. But I think some of the voters don't know what's going on, and they just think this is great. But I think there's just too many risks here, and I don't think we have enough data on this anyway. So
thank you very much.
That's how I feel.
Good evening. My name is John Townsend. I'm from AAA Mid-Atlantic in Washington. I'm here to testify about the impact of legalization in the District of Columbia, which is one of the few jurisdictions in the country that has legalized marijuana. The difference in the Maryland bill is that it allows for the sale of marijuana, which is not allowed in the District of Columbia. But yet our main concern, as Regina said a moment ago, is traffic safety. And even in the District of Columbia, where you have, let's say, 28 traffic fatalities a year, we know that marijuana is a factor in almost a fifth of all traffic crashes in the District of Columbia and in traffic deaths. And not only in terms of traffic, the safety impact, but also it's the second most commonly used drug detected in murder cases in the District of Columbia. You know that the murder rate in the district is off the chain. And also in terms of accidental deaths and in terms of suicide. It's a factor in all of these things. And if we think that legalization is going to solve the problems in our hard-hit communities, as this gentleman was saying, he's a fireman in the District of Columbia, in minority communities especially, like it's a magical wand that's going to make all of these problems go away, rather. We're kidding ourselves, deluding ourselves, and imperiling the most vulnerable communities of all. Another vulnerable community is those individuals on our highways who, as Regina testified a moment ago, are petrified of the fact of encountering a person driving under the influence of pot or any other drug or alcohol for that matter. The final thing, surveys show that 50% of all drivers think they can really drive under the influence of pot, and that is a dangerous precedent. And we need to avoid having that become a fait accompli in the state of Maryland. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any questions of this panel? Yes, Delegate Custer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My one question is there any test out there that can prove somebody is driving under the influence at the current time? You're talking about, people driving and being aware of, driving under the influence. Is there a test like a DUI test that can prove it? Is there anything around the corner? Is there anything, close?
Go ahead.
No, sir, there is not. Unlike alcohol, where a law enforcement officer can issue a field sobriety test on the side of the road, no such roadside test exists. Maryland does have drug recognition experts. In fact, in 2016, 2017, they arrested over 300 and some people impaired by cannabis, but there's no roadside test that can be conducted. Secondly to that, and I'm not an epidemiologist or a doctor, but we know that the levels of THC vary in your brain. So in other words, you could have consumed marijuana several days ago and still have the levels. So not only is it unclear how we can determine one's level of impairment, we have no sort of guidance if it was legal to give to people so that they would know sort of what's a safe amount to consume to then get behind the wheel of a car.
So the only way we would have is by using the drug experts to evaluate the people. Just to, there is some sort, there at least one check is having these people come out and evaluate the person. There just isn't a medical way of checking.
Yes. And there's no blood alcohol.
Right,
content.
that's what I mean.
Yes.
Right.
But what's happening in the District of Columbia is that in most fatal crashes, when a person is impaired, they discover that they have more than one drug in their system or his or her system.
Right.
And so what they do, they arrest on the alcohol charge, but they also know the person was perhaps under the influence of marijuana too.
Okay. Yeah, that's just one of my concerns, but I just wanted to hear whether or not there was an actual DUI test, and it doesn't look like there is one.
And I think that's a danger. That's not a godsend. I think that's a danger. Yes, sir. Go ahead. I'm sorry. That's like I just rule blows to me. Sorry about that, Mr. Chairman.
So used to talking to the media.
Used to being in church. Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I had a quick question. If somebody has a medical marijuana card because in Maryland and because they're sick or cancer or whatever, but they have it, and with Maryland state law, they're legally able to smoke marijuana. Even though they're really in violation of federal law, do you think that Maryland citizens should lose their right to bear arms? Just curious. Yes or no? Okay.
Who's the director? So we're concerned about the traffic safety implication. I'm worried like there are.
I don't think so. I was just curious what you thought about that. That's okay. Okay, that's fine.
Did he say bear arms? He said the right to bear arms, right?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
He said the right to bear arms, right? Yeah, let's
get to the next panel. Go ahead, Delegate Lewis.
I by no means am an expert on this, but as you asked a question about testing, I did happen to look up just if there's anything out there, and I found it on the Denver Post. It was saying that what is often tested, and you can correct me on this, is cannabinoid. It was mostly tested for carboxy THC. But that's an inactive metabolite within THC that can last for up to a month. And then, from my understanding, that the majority of the scientists are now saying that there are active ingredients that can test for recent use that they're trying out in California and other places. So that is to say, is it accurate to say that there are studies and tests to identify recent use as opposed to just being in someone's system currently?
I don't know enough about that, but apparently they do have a limit in Colorado. If you look at on page 3, they do have a limit on this. And this one, these 115 drivers that were involved in fatal wrecks, 71 were found to have high levels of THC.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an issue, and I think before we go jumping into this, I think we ought to look at the consequences.
No, I understand. I'm just
that's what I'm saying. I
just too. And we talked about the science.
Right,
so I just looked up quickly, not
right. I mean,
before this, what science was out there on this, and I would be happy to share this post with you. I just looked this up in like 2 minutes.
Okay. To answer your
I'll share
question,
it with my colleague, Delegate Custon, as well.
It's all in a state of flux. Tests are being developed, and you're right about this. And they will be available in the criminal justice system within a few years once it's proven that they can prove the level of intoxication or impairment.
Thank you very much. There's another panel.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to testify against the bill, come forward. Yes, sir. Come on up.
I came here to observe the process, and I started the research of this issue about legalization of marijuana back in 2013. I spent 30 years in law enforcement. A portion of that was spent as a Maryland State Trooper. A portion of it was spent with the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. A portion of that was spent with the Public Defender's Office as an intake supervisor. And a portion of that, 16 years of that 30 years, I spent as an educator at a community college teaching criminal justice and managing the criminal justice department. When I started this journey, I was challenged by another state trooper about whether legalization should even exist. And when he told me he was a proponent for it, I was opposed to that. And I said to him, no, we bust people. And these are my exact words. We bust people for weed. It's weed. It's marijuana. And he said, well, what you need to do is go look at this one site and get back to me and tell me what you think. And when he challenged me, because I was used to being challenged by my students when I'm teaching law in my classes, I'm not an attorney, okay? But when I'm teaching criminal law in my classes, my students are allowed to challenge me. And that's how they learn. And when I went and started the research, I actually found that what he had said to me to challenge me only led to more truth and more truth and more truth. Now, as I just enumerated to you, I've worked for different criminal justice or justice agencies. So I have a unique perspective and various perspectives on this issue. And let me speak to anybody in here who might be bringing God into this. I'm a Christian. I have not smoked marijuana since I was 18 years old. So that's been about 40 years ago. I don't have a desire to smoke it right now. But if I did, I would be breaking the law. It would be unethical for me to do it. But what I also have discovered is, from these various perspectives, is that this plant needs to be decriminalized, and there needs to be no criminalization associated with it at all. Research needs to be allowed to be conducted on this plant. The FDA prevents it, CSA prevents it, and it's a Schedule I drug. Now, if anybody understands what Schedule I, and I'm not going to take any more time than I absolutely need to, and please cut me short if you need to. But this drug is scheduled as a Schedule I by the DEA. So you understand the farce behind this. The DEA schedules it with heroin and LSD as a Schedule I. Schedule II is cocaine. Schedule III, there's a drug that you can get from any pharmacy with a prescription called Marinol or Dronabinol. You can get that drug right there, and it is synthetic marijuana. So at the natural stage or the state, marijuana is illegal. It's as dangerous as heroin. That's absolutely ridiculous. Now, I've retired from teaching criminal justice in 2014. I now work in the medical field for a local hospital. If I called it, you would know it. I work in the biomedical engineering department. I have seen people come into the emergency department who have drug addictions. A significant portion of them have been veterans, and they are addicted to opioids. Some of them taking 32 different opioid-based drugs to get through the day. That's just the day. And they cannot use marijuana because at the federal level, it's illegal, and the VA, therefore, cannot prescribe it.
The bill.
So let me stop.
Yeah, no, tell me what your position is on the bill.
My position is that you should legalize this. You should allow the people to vote.
You were supposed to testify before.
Well, you know what?
I mean, you got a little mixed up.
Well, sir, I was going to keep my mouth shut. I apologize. I was going to keep my mouth shut until I heard the last testimony.
You're the last testimony on this bill. We got another bill to go through.
I'm out of here.
Any questions?
Thank you very much for hearing me.
Thank you very much. All right. Anybody else here testify on the marijuana? You're up.
All right. Good evening, friends, colleagues. HB 1264. This is a bill to place the issue of cannabis legalization on this November